What an interesting genre that is. Sure, its music is very interesting and very strange at times, but also on how people feel about it, the reception of it. It seems that people either love it or they absolutely hate it and think it's basically indie hipster trash. It sounds like utter noise and people just trying to be different. You have your bands like Bark Psychosis, Mogwai, Explosions in the Sky, and Talk Talk. Today we're going to be talking about a rather infamous band of the post-rock genre. We're going to be discussing Godspeed You, Black Emperor. What an interesting title that is, because, well, no one exactly knows what it means, and it's got an exclamation mark right in the middle of it. It's like, Godspeed You, Black Emperor. It's a very odd thing, but, you know, no one really goes through to pronounce it like that. It's just Godspeed You, Black Emperor. A lot of people really think these guys are just trying to be artsy for the sake of artsy. These are the same people that think Mogwai is boring and think that Talk Talk sounds like an utter mess and that Bark Psychosis sounds literally like you're going crazy. These people are idiots. Today we're going to be talking about what is considered Godspeed You Black Emperor's finest album, and is considered by some to be one of the greatest albums of all time. A hidden gem, if you will. It's not that it's necessarily unknown, but it's not, when you think greatest album of all time, a lot of people will say something like Led Zeppelin 4, Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon. You know, while I may not think this is one of the greatest albums of all time, I do think this is a really, really good album and is worthy of recognition. You're not going to hear about it talked about as much because, unfortunately, due to the aggressively abrasive nature of the style of music and how strange and unapproachable it is, it's not as easily accessible as an album like Dark Side of the Moon. Now, this album is called Lift Your Skinny Fists Like Antennas to Heaven. And what an album it is. Clocking in at just around an hour and a half, it contains only 4 tracks. But each of these tracks has different subsets and movements to vary up the pace. We'll talk about each track and talk about my thoughts and feelings on them. Now, when it comes to post-rock, it's a very open genre. It has the conventions of rock, but yet doesn't go all the way with it. It's sort of a progressive rock in a way, but yet tends to veer more strictly on the side of progressive rather than the rock. It uses rock elements, but tends to dwell more on the progressive side, so things sound a lot more weird and strange, and doesn't necessarily stick to one conventional style. Just in this one album alone, we do have moments of rock, but we also have moments where it sounds like an entire orchestra is playing for us, an entire pit orchestra. We have moments of spoken word passages. We have entire soundscapes. We have drone. We have dark ambient. We have moments of jazz. We have just so much going on. What this album is very good at is creating a cinematic experience while you're listening to it. It almost feels like you're watching a movie unwind in front of you as you are hearing this. And the more you listen to it, the more the imagery of said movie becomes clear. Now, whether you allow your images to be formed by the titles of the tracks and subset movements, or you just let it go on from the sound itself, whatever the case is, the music here is very powerful. It takes all of your attention, which is interesting because while it's extremely multi-layered and there's a lot of artistry going on, it's not trying necessarily to be in your face. You know, it's a strange comparison to make, but say the new Flesh God Apocalypse album, Labyrinth. That album was so violently in your face and just fucking beating the shit out of you. It's like once you turn that thing on, it doesn't stop. This, while it commands all of your attention, rather is like a burning fire that sits there in front of you, maybe right this close to your face, but never consumes you. And it's brilliant like that. Now, this album is also very good at creating absolutely soaring beautiful highs where you feel on top of the world that anything is possible. But unfortunately, well, fortunately perhaps, These moments are very far and few in between. There's one near the very beginning, and perhaps in moments near the end where the album finally comes to recollection. But a large portion of the album is very dark, the ambience and the feeling, the sensations of it are very dark, dismal, and depressing. It's not in the same way that black metal or, God forbid, depressive suicidal black metal is. It's an ambient of bleak, almost depressive post-apocalyptic feeling. It's the feeling of bleakness, the feeling of perhaps melancholy mixed with a tinge of anger and tragedy. It's quite interesting. Let's get into it and talk about it a little bit more. So the first track is called Storm. And the entire first beginning, basically, it's called Lift Your Skinny Fists Like Antennas to Heaven. That's the first 6 minutes of that. And then the next 11 minutes, I really put them together because they tend to sound the same. Or rather, no. I never mind that. The first 6 minutes are completely different from the next 11. Lift Your Skinny Fists Like Antennas to Heaven, just that 6-minute movement, is one of the highest moments of the album. The intro, it brings you in with this feeling of slowly starting and then building and building and building and building. You think it just can't get any higher as it slowly ascends like you're climbing a mountain and you feel like you can never see the top. And the emotion here is so very powerful. It just continues to grow and grow upon you as you listen. More elements are added as the track progresses. It starts off with a very slow sort of sound intro, and then you have, I'm not sure what instrument it is. It's most likely like a horn or trumpet comes in, and slowly things build. You even hear some glockenspiel in there. It's wonderful. And it builds and builds till you just hit this utmost peak. And it's great, and you just feel everything. This is amazing. You know, this is the power of whatever. It's great. The soaring high. This band is amazing at creating the highest highs and lowest lows. When you think they've gone as far as possible, they take it one step further. After that, there's Gathering Storm, or Tu pleures mourir. I don't speak alien, that's French. But that's Clatters Like a Worry. And that is now, it's what you'd think. We had this beautiful, beautiful intro. Warm, inviting, welcoming, and absolutely jubilant. Although it never feels like it's this kind of thing where you want to, yeah, I'm so happy. It's perhaps the feeling that one would expect to feel when welcomed into heaven upon their death. Whatever religion you subscribe to, it doesn't matter. I'm just referring to the metaphorical sense of a warm, glowing happiness that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be bouncing around for joy, but yet inside it grows and builds to immeasurable lengths. But it fades very quickly and goes into the Gathering Storm. That 11 minutes passes by extremely fast. The use of the instrumentation here is sounding like a pit orchestra, as well as pianos and everything else in the noise is brilliant. I wasn't even aware this was an 11-minute section. Now, some people say this part is where you hear a cover of sorts of Amazing Grace, I believe. I've not actually heard it anywhere on the album. I've been listening for it, but I've never heard it. The strings in this section are beautiful, and I think perhaps I could kind of hear what they're talking about with this sort of cover of it, and it almost feels sinister in a way, but I don't pick up on it really. I think this is the section where they say it is, but I haven't heard it in the rest of the album regardless, and this is the closest thing to it. But whatever the case is, this section is not necessarily depressing, but it's not necessarily happy either. It just continues onward, and it shifts and molds and never stays the same for too long and keeps you very interested. And then we get into my favorite section of Storm, aside from the amazing 6-minute opener. We get to the last two sections, which total up to about 4 minutes. The Welcome to Barco AM and PM into Cancer Towers on Holy Road Highway. That Welcome to Barco AMP is just basically, it's a slowly degrading supermarket announcement saying, welcome to Barco AMP, if any individual offers to pump gas, wipe your windows, or offers products of unsolicited nature, please report to blah, 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 blah. It's this looping supermarket announcement. But as it goes on more and more, the music and ambience slowly starts to build over it and envelop it and take it over. And then we get a new spoken word announcement thing in there, because I think those may be heavily distorted airport announcements, because in parentheses after welcome to Barco AM/PM there's LAX, LAX Airport, 51400. Now obviously that's May 14th, 2000. Now I know this album came out in 2000. I'm not sure exactly of the day, unless that's what they're marking in there. Yeah, it came out in October of 2000, so go figure. It was recorded in 9 days, so there could be some significance to that. I don't know. But basically, I think those may be airport announcements. Even Wikipedia links the LAX to the airport. But it's heavily distorted. You can't even pick out what it's saying. And it's shifting around in between your ears, going back and forth. And there is this wonderful piano in with it. And it drags onward and continues. The unintelligible announcements go from near the end of the A&P announcements into basically the entirety of Cancer Towers on Holy Road Highway. And this is where the album starts to really draw in its more dark and dismal feelings. It doesn't feel happy anymore, and it doesn't even feel neutral anymore. Things start to feel a little bit depressing. It, to me, conjures up images of a world now without people, but yet these announcements are now automated and they continue regardless. Flickering, staticky TVs, lights flashing on and off, things kept in disrepair, and just the slow movement throughout it, seeing as the world and our human infrastructure falls apart without people. I'll explain the imagery I saw listening to this album after we're done talking about the musical side of it. After that, it's a surprisingly fast track. We go into an also excellent track called Static. That begins with a 3.5-minute section called Terrible Canyons of Static. It's in which we hear train sound effects and a little bit of an ambient build, and then near the end of it, we do get to the actual static, though it's not like some oppressive, violent smacking your face static. It's just there and it feels very ambient. It's not the terrible canyon of static. But yeah, again, the dark nature of it, the alone nature of it, the album feels very forlorn and lonely. And that's further increased there when you hear this track. And this keeps the dark feeling of Cancer Towers on Holy Road Highway. And it continues on that. The feeling that you are completely alone in this world that the album is being created within. And it's powerful, really is. And then you have the brief moment, Atomic Clock, in which you hear some voice saying, universal time is now, blah, blah, blah. Basically the idea of the atomic clock closer to warfare, of destroying everybody, with the heavy static behind it and the voice is a little bit distorted. And then transitions to one of the most interesting moments on the album, which is chart number 3. This is quite the moment on the album, and it really sets the tone for the movement that comes after it. If I refer to any of these as tracks, forgive me, because there's only 4 tracks. There's Storm, Static, Sleep, and what was it, Antennas to Heaven. So if I refer to any of the movements as tracks, forgive me. But when we get to chart number 3, it's very interesting. It's very twisted in a way. We hear, it's mainly a solo string section. And we hear the voice of a woman, but it's pitch shifted. And she's talking about having seen heaven, having witnessed God, and how it is such an overwhelming experience that you feel like you've gone insane, and that perhaps people who have been high on drugs and people who are locked up in insane asylums have have penetrated the innermost layers of heaven and have witnessed, past the headless serpents, and have witnessed the true scorching power of God, so much so to the point where you feel like you've gone insane, and that your heavenly body there, whether you're the woman, child, man, you are there in your heavenly body, and you'll feel like you have lost all control. You feel like you've gone insane, but yet you are there. And it reminded me of a black metal project that's sort of an unblack black metal, of the idea, I forget what it was called, but it was the concept of God in heaven, but not aggressive God, but not a loving God, but basically the fact that heaven and God are so powerful that is beyond our comprehension, and that to stand in the presence of it, to be in heaven, is almost more torturous than hell, because of God's immense, crushing might, and how it is beyond comprehension to be alongside the creator of the universe, and how violent it is in a way. This reminded me of that. It's very creepy hearing the very forlorn strings and this pitch shift to make it sound like a man speaking. Eventually this fades off into another one of my favorite moments on the album, a 9-minute section, almost 10, called World Police and Friendly Fire. This, it evokes images of global oppression and warfare and death. And this begins off with a very interesting guitar, doom, 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 and the strings continuing, creating a very dismal atmosphere that molders and burns and grows and builds to a very, very high point, and then down, and then back up again, crazy as it gets faster and faster. It starts slow and builds. And this is a trend that we notice throughout the album. And to me, Storm and Static, those tracks are the most standout when it comes to this. And I love the way World Police Friendly Fire sounds, because it evokes such dark, dark imagery and feels so violent, and you feel so lonely and so scared throughout it. And it reaches a fever pitch. When they play live, they have the screens behind them when Godspeed plays live, and you see flames, and you see military violence, and you see darkness and fire. It's intense, and it's very hellish. And then after it all happens and it reaches the fever pitch, you have the buildings, they are sleeping now. And that is a 5-minute sort of track of recapitulation. It's somber, it's quiet, and it allows you to basically restore after the intensity and violence and intense feeling of World Police Friendly Fire. But yet, it's not a happy restoration. It's horrifying, yet still. When you think of it, the buildings, they are sleeping. I think of, once again, a world without people. And the buildings are left as monuments to a species that once was, slowly degrading and falling apart. And the fact that they are personified with sentience, that these buildings were once alive, but now that humanity is no more, the buildings are sleeping. It's sort of scary in a way. I think of a completely empty city just falling apart, and the buildings sleep. It's very strange, but it's beautiful. And then we go on to the second disc with Sleep and Antennas to Heaven. I didn't find these tracks to be as interesting as the other two, but they're still very good. Sleep begins with Maury Austral, and They Don't Sleep Anymore on the Beach. This is a spoken word section where I suppose this man is talking about Coney Island. Used to be the playground of the world. He talks about how back in the day Coney Island used to be, there was no place like it. It was one of the most wonderful places, and people used to sleep on the beach, and it used to be wonderful. It was, the amusement park of everything, and it was fantastic and epic and amazing. And this creates some thoughts of joy when you're hearing this, like, oh, that's so nice. Then you hear, that doesn't happen anymore. It's not the same place, not anymore. And then this continues into Monheim, which continues from the idea of lost happiness, lost hope. And this one is very guitar heavy. But again, this is very progressive, but there's not these crazy solos. It's a droney guitar. It's not the same drone like Sun or Nadja or Tim Hecker or something like that, or Angelic Process. But yet it's still a very omnipresent drone, and it's wonderful. And this guitar builds and builds and just is grinding, going on to you, very intense. It feels like your brain is going to leak out of your ears as it builds and grows, and then brings itself back during Broken Windows Locks of Love Part 3. Once again, an extended recapitulation from the intensity that Mannheim builds to. But still, it never feels happy, and it feels forlorn and lost. And then we have Antennas to Heaven, with quite a few movements to it. It begins with Moya sings Baby O, and that's basically just a sound sample recording. And then goes to Edgy Wings Set Acid, again a very brief section, and then a Glockenspiel duet, which is recorded on a campsite in Rhinebeck, New York, which is cool because that's the state I live in. I live in New York. And all these sections sort of all go together, and it's sampled sections, it's ambient sections, and they're all less than a minute, but it works very well. And then Attention Mon Ami, fa la 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 la, 55th Street, Laurent. Again, just over a minute that one is. I almost feel bad when I tell you about the things that happen here because I don't want to spoil the surprises of the album, which is why I'm keeping this last track a secret, because there's a lot of surprises on here. And then you have the last three movements, the first of which is the longest on the song, which I love the title of this. She dreamt she was a bulldozer. She dreamt she was alone in an empty field. What are the implications of that? That's quite the interesting thought. Along the same lines of the buildings they are sleeping now. This track does not feature the same sort of darkness and intensity and perhaps scariness of Static and Sleep. But yet at the same time, this feels like recapitulation, the track, the restoration, the track, as we're coming back from all the darkness. But yet it never feels like the same triumphant brightness and lightness and warmth of the beginning of Storm. It yet still feels like we're in a world now left hurt and wounded. But yet it feels like it's trying to regrow again. And then we have the last two sections, Death Camp Drone and Antennas to Heaven. And this wraps up the album wonderfully. I don't want to tell you too much about it because it's great and you need to listen to it and experience it for yourself. But by the end of the album, you'll feel wholly satisfied. It's an intense experience. Now, I said after I talked about the sound of it, I'm going to talk about what I envisioned as I listened. At first during Storm, I didn't know what to see until I got to Welcome to Barco AM and PM, and I saw the empty supermarkets, with the flickering TVs and lights and shit just everywhere and the announcements continuing. I picture maybe this is a little while later in the future where these announcements are automated and they continue on regardless. Static is where my imagery of the album truly began to form. I was inspired by this from during the beginning, during Terrible Canyons of Static, is where the imagery began to form. It was a post-apocalyptic thing, in a way, inspired by the documentary Life Without People. It's not that there was global war or anything. It's not like we all got blown up, but we all just disappeared. It's similar here, but instead, it was rather the human race died very quickly, and there was maybe only one or two survivors. But how did they die? Well, that was developed in my thoughts as the track went on. But during this track, I pictured through the sounds of trains and stuff, I pictured a man walking through a train yard, and let's say now at this point in time, trains are automated, and they continue on no matter what without input from any human. And inside of the trains, perhaps you can see years old, however long they are, but they're decaying and various sorts of disgust. You see corpses all about the trains, whether they were people going about their business, whether they were people who were just riding the train, whether there was violence, whatever there was, there are skeletons, rotting corpses, and perhaps fresh ones. These train cars are now coffins. And it creates some very starkly ghastly imagery. then into chart, and they just continue to go along the same routes as always, shipping the dead back and forth. And then you have chart number 3, into atomic clock chart number 3, which then basically the distorted narration reminded me of the final chapter, the final story of a book I read called Haunted by Chuck Palahniuk. He wrote Survivor and Fight Club. So, he's a great author. And at the end in one of the last chapters of Haunted, we were given a short story about a world where basically the afterlife is confirmed, but the only way to get there is if every single member of the human race commits suicide. And then the human race as a collective can reach salvation. And I was reminded of this this chapter during this movement. And I considered now there was a man on earth, perhaps the one that was speaking during chart number 3, even though it was a woman, that the afterlife has been found. It's real. It's beyond comprehension. And the only way to get there is suicide. And the better chance you have better chances of reaching heaven, of reaching salvation, the more painful your death is. And also, getting killed by someone else works well, but suicide's the best way. And thus, the imagery started to take shape during Friendly Fire World Police, in which our protagonist is walking throughout the world and seeing the after effects of this ghastly revelation. Seeing, much like the world of Dying Light, he's seeing people who have jumped from bridges and are now decaying dead on the road, seeing people who have hung themselves from buildings and bridges, seeing people who have just murdered themselves in all sort of ghastly ways. At the train yard, perhaps jumping in front of trains, perhaps hanging themselves from highways, perhaps jumping out of buildings, perhaps throwing themselves into machinery or using various weapons. It's a dark segment in the album. And that's where the imagery started to take place. This is a world, this is a race, a human race who once held dominion over the planet, now has killed itself, intentionally, believing that the salvation lies on the other side of death. And there's maybe 1 or 2 people left alive in the entire planet. And we're following one of them as he surveys the utter devastation. It creates the heavy sense of loneliness, fear, and cold loss and depression. And the loneliness is strong as you see the corpses swing from the bridges. He witnesses everything. In fact, he does witness some people actively kill themselves as well during some sections, I felt. And, of course, some of the imagery implied by the titles of these tracks, like Cancer Towers on Holy Road Highway. When I listened, I didn't look at the movements or the track names. I just listened. And then afterwards, I matched it up. I was like, oh, that's interesting. And, of course, the buildings there sleeping now just continues that thought where it may not be that intense, dark, forlorn feeling of World Priest Friendly Fire. It still has that extreme loss and forlorn loneliness. And then Sleep got rather dark because you hear Maury Austral talking about Coney Island. And I felt our protagonist went to Coney Island at this point and said they don't sleep anymore on the beach. Yeah, but what does he find on the beach but corpses lining everywhere? Whether they be in towels or people who are just there. He sees body bags and bodies floating in the water. Decayed bodies. Sees people who have committed suicide in the motors and gears of rides and Ferris wheels. People have jumped and hanged themselves. People who have used the cooking utensils, knives, fryers, and things to destroy themselves. Ghastly dark things. All because they believed that the more violently they killed themselves, the better chances they would have of reaching salvation. And he is witnessing these things, and it's bright as day, and that's why it's strange. It's an absurd situation at a place that should be happy in a bright sunny day, but all this death is omnipresent, and it's dark. During Monheim, we actually, in my mental story, we get to see this prophet, the one who believed that this was the way out. And he's alive still, actively encouraging people to still take these steps on this path. And he is in turmoil. He frequently will cut designs into his skin and make himself bleed and hurt. He'll eat glass to prolong his suffering and kill himself slowly and painfully. And it's dark and brutal, and he perhaps wonders if he is wrong. And as he wonders, he continues to wound himself deeper. It's very dark, and he is in one of the buildings that is sleeping, looking out over everything. I considered perhaps seeing this all take place in something like New York City or Chicago. And it's very dark and forlorn. And just as well with Broken Windows, Locks of Love. That's where I especially saw it. During Broken Windows, he was walking through, our main character was walking through an abandoned building, like an office building, and witnessing people who had killed themselves with simple means. Their office supplies, paper cutters, pencils, pens, and done ghastly things. And there's a man there who even at the last minute, he's considering if he wants to shoot himself, but is he going to do it? But he does. And it creates the dark imagery, perhaps broken lights flickering and papers everywhere, and that things have gone to chaos, much like the environments of Dying Light or a horror movie, where just everything is strewn everywhere and it's a mess and it's all in decay. And loneliness is omnipresent. But near the end of Broken Windows, Locks of Love, the prophet, whoever he may be, I pictured him bald, wearing very little. During the end of this, he sees another way, perhaps, to get himself closer to his salvation, and cuts his face off and removes it. And during the last section, Antennas to Heaven, we see ultimately as human race slowly, finally is done. We have maybe our 1 or 2 survivors left, but even the prophet has lost hope, thinking perhaps he was right or perhaps he was wrong, but it matters not, for he cannot exist in this state anymore, and he flings himself from the building. And our main character continues to wander throughout this dark, forlorn, empty, depressing world. And the music continues to build around it. And the music continues to build around it and work as a soundtrack. It really felt like a feature-length horror film. And it was powerful, crushing, and intense. And I encourage you to go and listen to this album and form your own opinions on what you thought the music sounded like, if it crafted a very cinematic experience for you. I felt it did, and it feels at times almost like it's religious because it's so strong and powerful. And there's some soaring highs on this album where it feels utterly amazing, and there's some very dark, dark lows. The imagery is intense, the album is very transcendent, very intense, very beautiful, but yet very dark and very lonely and empty and full of anguish. But yet it's not without hope. Because hope shines through at certain moments, as well as on the final track and near the very beginning. But it's an album that's definitely worth listening to. If you're into the avant, progressive side of music, and you like post-rock, and you like experimental things, and you're willing to sit through an hour and a half of some really weird stuff, check this album out. You can't go wrong with it, and I love it. I've listened to it about 5 or 6 times since I heard it just the other day. I think it's fantastic. It's an emotional, visual, sensory ride. And it's intense, and it's cinematic, and it's beautiful, it's artful. I love it. Definitely check it out. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming out. My name is Kenshin, and I'm peacing the fuck out. We'll see you guys later.